What was it for kind of
I knew
experience?
I knew I was connected to everything.
Ah,
I knew in that experience as this kid, the experience was just this overpowering light and feeling connected. And I experienced love.
mm,
I experienced the field was the field of love, of being loved. So here I am holding my hard copy of Psychosynthesis. I hadn't read it. I don't believe it. He said, I am my I am my girlfriend. Just finished her basic training in California, in San Francisco last week.
but what was your first impression?
He my first impression was how perceptive he was. He saw people. I mean,
Mm,
he saw in my language, he saw the self in the person. He saw the being. And that's
yeah.
who he saw and talked to.
Hi, Roger, and welcome to Psychosynthesis Conversation. It's such a great joy and honor to have you here today. And you are a very well known figure within the psychosynthesis community. You are the director and owner, together with your dear wife, Joan, of the Psychosynthesis Institute in London. And you have been around for quite some years. So I'm very excited to have this conversation with you today.
Thank you, Kenneth. Yeah, it's exciting to be with you. And, you know, I'm old and wrinkly and you're less old and wrinkly. So that's, it's, it's good for us to meet sometimes like this. Yeah. So thank you. I'm looking forward, Kenneth.
Yeah, and today we would like to hear a bit about your story, how the both of you came into psychosynthesis, but also, of course, what is going on at the institute, the different programs you are offering, and why psychosynthesis has been such a central part of your life for so many years. So perhaps we could
Yeah.
start from the beginning.
Very good. Well,
So,
thank you for this, Kenneth, and and thanks for the introduction. Um, where to start? Well, I'm not going to start very at the very beginning, but I'll tell you a little bit around the etiology of how I and Joan got into psychosynthesis, because that's really a critical turning point in my life.
yeah.
Um, I had but I will go back a bit further if it's useful to you. I had a spiritual, religious experience when I was 13, 14 at my local church, interestingly. It's Church of England, so it was a Protestant Christian environment. And I've been
Mm.
part of the choir for years and years singing. And it was the time of Billy Graham. That's even before your time, I think, but certainly
Mm.
Billy Graham was a huge Christian orator that traveled the world running these huge groups. And friends of mine were going to see him, and I just didn't want to go. I didn't like that environment.
Mm.
But I had this experience in the church one night, and I went to see one of the church wardens, one of the men who looked after the church and people, and 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 I met with him in the vestry, and I told him about the experience. And this man, he must have been late 50s.
Mm.
He was very generous with me and very kind. And he said he heard me fully. And this young 13, 14-year-old was babbling about this light he was seeing and this experience. And he said, why don't we just quietly pray together? And he
Mm.
held me metaphorically and in that space. And it was such a powerful time. And that really, why I'm talking about that is that underpins a lot of this connection to psychosynthesis,
Mm.
because
Could you could you say a bit more about the experience? What was it for kind of
I knew
experience?
I knew I was connected to everything. Uh,
Ah,
I knew in that experience as this kid that I was connected to the whole. I mean, that's the language I'm using now.
Yeah.
Experience was just this overpowering light and feeling connected. And I experienced love. I experienced the field was the field of love, of being loved and loving. So, and this older man was wonderful with me. He was gentle. He wasn't hard. But he was gentle. And it was such a contrast to the experience of the friends of mine who were going to Billy Graham, where they were full of this energy, which was totally different from the experience I had. So it was so profound. It changed my life in the sense that for the next 3 years, I was quite a devotee and spoke about the experience even at that young age. And then I closed everything off. I closed the whole, suppressed the whole thing when I went to university and during my early adult years. I cut off totally. It was too much.
Yeah.
And then I did a course. It was called Mind Dynamics. It was part of the Silver Mind Control ethos when I was 30, and I reconnected to that experience. This was a course in self-hypnosis, and I reconnected to that experience, and I was fairly spontaneous in those days. I had resigned from my job, which was in those days, it was a very big job. I was running part of a pharmaceutical organization across Europe, and I resigned, and I started running this course in Mind Dynamics, and I ran that for 2 years. And it was and we trained a lot of people in that process. And during that, I was part of a meditation group. I used to go up to Edinburgh every 2 weeks to study meditation with a healer called Bruce McManaway, the most wonderful guy. And during
what time are we in here? Are we in start 60s?
No, this is the early 70s.
Okay, yes.
This is that tells you how old I am. So this was in the early 70s, and in 71, 73, that period. And studying with Bruce McManaway, one of his colleagues was a really extraordinary woman called Eileen Churchill. And Eileen Churchill ran a teachers training college here in northern England. And I taught her I used to run a program in Edinburgh for every 2 weeks, and she came to some of the program. And she said, "What you're doing is very similar to a workshop I attended a month ago." And I said, "What was that?" She said it was called psychosynthesis. So I'd never heard of it. And she said, "I think you should find out about it." Anyway, I did. So she was the entry door. She was the porthole. And we knew Eileen for many years afterwards. But and so I called up Psychosynthesis, and I spoke to then Bill Ford Robertson, who'd started the Psychosynthesis and Education Trust in the mid 60s. And it had closed down at that point. So this was in the spring, early summer of 1973. And I went to Foyles and I bought the last hard copy of Psychosynthesis in Foyles, up the bookshop here. And I went to a friend of mine who'd said to me, "You've got to meet a guy pal of mine called John Whitmore. And this had gone on for 2 years. He'd been asking me to meet John. And so anyway, one night I bought this book and I went to his apartment for dinner. And as I went in, he said, John's here. He said, "You won't believe it. You've got to meet John." So here I am holding my hard copy of Psychosynthesis. I hadn't read it. Went into John sitting in this sofa, and we introduced ourselves. And he said, "What have you got there?" I said, "Well, this is a book. It's called Psychosynthesis." He said, "I don't believe it." He said, I I and my girlfriend just finished a basic training in California, in San Francisco last week on
Wow.
psychosynthesis. So that was the beginning.
Yeah.
And so I said, so we talked about this, and he told me how it was. So he and Diana had done this course. And so that I went back to Bilford Robertson. I saw him the following day. And again, the synchronicities, Ken, I mean, they're really stupid at that time, because I go
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
see Bill, and who I'd got to know. And I said, look, I met John Whitman last night. He'd just done psychosynthesis. I bought the book. I showed him the book, and he said, well, there's another synchronicity. This morning I received the catalog from the Psychosynthesis Institute in San Francisco, and they have a basic training that starts in 2 weeks. So we signed up and went to that basic training, and that was in end of June, beginning of July 1973.
Okay. And
And
you
I
were,
read the book. Go ahead.
yeah, and you
I
were
was
with
what?
Joan. You were with Joan at that point.
Yes. Well, I'd fallen in love with this beautiful woman
Mm.
in March in 1973, and and that was it. You know, I'd just fallen in love with her, and so
Yes.
uh, and so I went to San Francisco to do the basic training, and I read the book on the plane. It's an 11-hour flight, so I read, and I know you know this. I'm sure you've had similar experiences. But I felt reading that book, I'd come home.
Yeah.
It
Exactly.
answered me so much of my story, and that early story of awakening. It
Yeah.
just answered it.
Yeah.
And so it was incredibly powerful. So I did this. It was a month-long course there. The basic training was a month long, and I did it together with people I still know,
Mm.
and it was amazing. And then at the end of that, I said it was run by Jim Varju and a small team, Steve Carl, other people, and I said to Jim at the end, I said, I want to bring psychosynthesis to the UK,
Mm.
because even though the Psychosynthesis Education Trust wasn't operating, but I said I really want to do that. He said, if you're going to do that, he said, you need to go and talk to Assagioli.
Mm.
And also to Frank Hilton. Do you remember Frank Hilton, Kenneth?
Yes. Uh,
Yeah,
the
he's an
secretary at the Psychosynthesis Research Foundation.
That's right. Well, Frank Hilton was just an amazing friend and character. So I called Frank and said, "This has just happened," and so he said, "You got to go and see Roberto, and do that
Mm.
as soon as you can." So we came back, and we then went to see Roberto in at his holiday house in early September, and met him then, and met Piero. Actually, Piero was a young kid then.
Okay, yes, he was not that old in
I
the
know. Well,
early
he was.
70s.
Oh, it was lovely. We met him, but we spent time with Roberto, and that was very special. And we were there for about 5 days, and then we
Mm.
went back and studied with Roberto later, the following year, and then again just before he died. So we spent a bit of time with him,
Mm.
and so that was how I started with
Yeah.
Psychosynthesis, and it just pulled so many things together. And we started the institute when we came back at the end of September 1973.
Wow. Yes, that's quite early. What was your, what was your impression of Assagioli? Many spoke of him as this kind soul, but what was your first impression?
My first impression was how perceptive he was.
Mm.
He 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 saw people. I
Mm.
mean, he saw, in my language, he saw the self in the person. He saw the being, and that's
Yeah.
who he saw and talked to. He had them. It was very funny. I mean, he was tone deaf by the time I met him.
Yeah.
So all communication was on little slips of paper. I'd write a question, and then he'd look at it and then giggle and and then reply. And then when we talked to him, we would say things and write them down, and we'd have one. It would be one-to-one. There would be nobody else there, so that was great. But he was very warm. I remember him saying to Joan, "Always remember that you are a mother first." Isn't that interesting?
Yes, very interesting.
Just, and that's what I mean, the perception, but his context. And he was an amazing mystic, but he wasn't just a mystic. He was very much a scientist, and he was very compelling in what he talked about, Kenneth, because he was very clear.
Yeah.
In those days. And remember when that was? This is 1973. There was nothing out there, nothing really. There was some activity in Italy, and the Varjus in the States, and Martha Crampton was in Canada, but there was nothing here in the rest of Europe. But what he was very clear about, he said, "Look, I'm not interested in creating an ism. I want psychosynthesis to be expressed by the individuals who really understand it and get it." And we said to him, "So should we come here, Roberto, and be trained by you?" He said, "No." He said, "No, that's not the best place these days." He said, "Go to California, go to Jim, who was a student of his, go to Jim Varju, and what he's developing there is really fine. Go there and study with in San Francisco."
Yeah.
So that's what we did, and starting in 1973, and I would go back, or we go back in the Christmas time and again in the summer, and spend the whole summer in training, and I'd bring when we started the institute, we would bring San Francisco trainers here to the UK as well, and we'd work with them, and we ran our first fundamentals course in 1975.
Wow.
So,
Wow. Yes.
yeah, so that's 2 years, and they staffed it for us. So we started this whole process in 1975. Can't
And
believe it's 49 years.
and that's a whole chapter. The San Francisco Institute, they were quite successful for a while. I remember the Synthesis magazine or journal that came out in, I guess it is around 40,000 copies.
Oh, it was huge.
It was a huge journal, and there were quite some accomplished people who had connection with Maslow. So it was a very, in some respect, thriving community, as far as I've heard, the first year. And then at some point, it turned into something not so good. Some characterized it as a cult.
Yes, well, it was. Let's be very clear. The early days, from '73, when we were first involved with Jim and the Institute, it was a very alive, very vigorous, and very strong center in terms of development. And people like the John Furmans, the Tom Yeomans, and the Martha Cramptons were as writers, as contributors to synthesis, were fantastic. And the quality of that journal and was extraordinary and very, very strong.
Yeah.
And we became very, as you know, we were trained there, and we became very close to these good folk. People like Betty Carter-Ha, and you probably don't know her, but Betsy rather. She was a very early trainer of ours, working with Jim and Susan, and then we met Mark Horowitz, and we are lifelong friends. We met the Horowitzes in 1974, and Tom, etc. And gradually, And then we became, when was it, late 1976, Joe and I became directors of the Institute in San Francisco.
Mm.
And we became part of that director group. There were 12 of us.
Okay.
And initially, that was an extraordinary, here were the 12, Tom wasn't part of that early time, Mark was. There were a whole bunch of folk in that group. And this was a group of some of the most loving, spiritually focused psychologists I'd ever been with and met, or we had. And gradually we became tighter, we became closer together. And as that tightness continued, then it started to get difficult. And I'm saying it that way. I'll tell you totally, I'll be as transparent as I can about what happened, because I think it's important people know. I think it's very important people know. The whole group came here to London, and we hosted the whole group here in the Christmas of '77, when things were okay. They were okay, and I think we were doing good work, and as a whole. And then we moved to San Francisco. I spent 8 months in San Francisco from the beginning of 1978. And Jo came in, she spent 6, 7 months. So we were away from the family during that time. And we were working on building the Synthesis Graduate School.
Yes.
That was the focus. And what started to happen was that Jim became much more central. He'd always been central. I'm talking about Jim Varju.
Yes.
He became much more central. He was the most extraordinary individual, by the way, intellectually brilliant, and absolutely brilliant. And his thinking was quite stunning. And people forget that when they see how difficult things were and how it went. But we must remember that at the core, this was this extraordinary mind who was able to, he developed theories around psychosynthesis that were extraordinary. And then gradually we became tighter and more focused. And that's when things started going wrong. And things started going wrong, and our behavior became cultish. With Jim at the center, and essentially the rest of us were serving Jim, if I'm honest. And by what we did that was wrong was that we harmed other people, because the way we spoke about other people, other centers, we started polarizing and making what we were doing the best and everybody else second best. And that was wrong. And as a consequence, in my view, rightly or wrongly, as a consequence, it became so tight that we couldn't see anything other than what was inside. It was classic narcissistic behavior, but to an extreme, and it was cultish behavior. And we did wrong things. We punished other people in psychosynthesis for not doing it right. And so we became very isolated. Joan and I were fortunate, Kenneth, very fortunate, because we lived here in Europe, even though we've been living in San Francisco for months. We came back, and I left. A very, very good friend of ours, a man called Marco de Vries, professor in Rotterdam. I used to teach there every month. But during that period, I went back, and I had a teaching commitment at the end of June, beginning of July in '78. And I realized what we were doing was wrong. And I called them and said, "I'm sorry, I'm leaving. I can't continue to do this." And I wasn't very popular for doing that.
No, I guess so.
And you can imagine, and this went on, and I had all these phone calls. Anyway, to cut a long story short, I left, and Joan being Joan, and quite rightly, very honorably said, "Well, I have to make my own decision." So she went back I'd left, went back to San Francisco and had, can you believe it, a 24-hour session with the group about why
Wow.
she should. Can you imagine?
Yeah.
But that's how things had become so. And then she left. And so she left that summer. And so in some ways, it's very easy to say it now.
We are in summer. Is it summer 78 or 79?
No, 78. No, we left in summer 78. And already at that time, I had 15 applicants for the Synthesis graduate school here in Europe, because I had a campus in London and one in Rotterdam. And I'd written to hundreds of people in my network about the graduate school. So these people applied to do an MA. And I had to write to them and say, we're not going to do it, and explain why. But the graduate school, Mark Horowitz was the dean. It started up in San Francisco and ran for a couple of years and then folded as gradually more people left. Mark didn't leave until 1980 or so, and then other people after that. So it was a very painful experience. But let me just say this, because it's really quite important for transparency. We learned so much from Jim and that whole experience. So it's very easy to make it all bad. It wasn't. There was some fantastic learnings that I hope we've brought forward in terms of what we do now. But essentially, and at some point, you have to say, and you have to take responsibility for what you did. And we tried to help other people as they came out. But we've always seen that that's something we have to be responsible for.
Yeah. Would you call, is this a blend of, you have actually tremendous success. This was a time where, transpersonal psychology was just developing and emerging out of humanistic psychology. And you have this very potent group that are really doing great job and publishing this journal. So of course there can be reasons to believe that you are high evolved, and perhaps some arrogance come in, and feeling of power, being on top of the world, and then all the shadows come up. Because I've heard that there was control issues, that people from this San Francisco Institute went to other centers in the US and demanded loyalty, or else they were expelled from the psychosynthesis community, stuff like that.
I can say I wasn't part of that. I don't remember that. I know.
No.
I can imagine things like that happening. I'm saying it that way. However, I think a lot of that has been exaggerated. I think there may be one or two instances where that was the case. Yes. Certainly, we did things that were wrong, Ken. Bottom line. And I think, as an individual, and I know Joe would say this, we have to take responsibility for that. What is sad, and this is very important, what's very sad is that it truly damaged psychosynthesis in the US.
Yeah.
And I'm not looking at the only reason why psychosynthesis hasn't grown and been successful, but it was certainly one of the reasons. The other reason was that, as you know, the states have a very state-wise control on accreditation of counselors, psychotherapists.
Yeah.
That's another part of it, but that's not the only reason. The other reason is what we did. And part of what we're trying to do now is to see whether it's possible to shift some of that.
Exactly. Yeah, and actually, if the viewers want to read more about this, there is two books about it. Michael Schuller's book about, he interviews a lot of the people involved in this, And there is also the AAP handbook about the psychosynthesis history. So, but if we now turn to England and
there's another book that's also very important, and it's called The Power of We, which is Mark Horowitz's book.
oh yeah,
And remember, you see, Mark was there all the way through that until he left. And it's an important piece of work. It really is. But the critical thing, Ken, for me, and I'm saying this because I believe it, is that we learned hugely from that experience. I'm talking about Joan and myself. And how do you take an experience like that? Because we learned so much, both in a positive sense, but we also learned about how things can go wrong. And hopefully we've transformed that into our teaching today.
Yeah. So afterwards, you were then, you had then a new task in building up on the ruins of the San Francisco Center. It collapsed in 1980, but you were actually...
later, actually. Yeah, but anyway, yes, but around 80, 81, yeah.
Yeah. And when did you start this new program in the UK?
Well, we'd always had it. We'd had it since 1975, so that was continuing. We began, you can imagine, we began our first training cohort. They were all people who were humanistic psychologists. They were Gestalt therapists. They were, that whole range. We began that in 75, and that continued. And then we also took over the training in Holland for a group in 1976.
Yes.
As this whole thing blew up. And we continued training here in this country and in Holland in parallel. And that was really important. And we had in that training, there were parallel tracks, and we would go to Holland once a month. We'd run a team of 5 of us. We would do therapy and psychosynthesis therapy, and then we'd run our training weekends. And then both groups, we would then come together for a summer school with both groups for 2 weeks every summer. It was a very powerful period. And over the years, both here in the UK and also in Holland, these were 2 very important tracks coming together. And one of our trainees, a man called, you may have heard of him, Michael O'Regan. He was an Irish priest, a Dominican priest. He was in training. He was in training with us in the mid-70s in one of the first training groups. And when he graduated in 79, we helped him found Eckhart House, which was the Irish Psychosynthesis Institute. And because of his role in the Dominican Order, he got the Dominican Order to provide a house for them, and so he ran Eckhart. No, it was a very interesting. So we helped him build that training in Ireland as well. So there were these 3 tracks really: Ireland, UK, and Holland, that ran the same program actually. That we had
and
developed.
How many years of training was that in the early?
Well, to become a psychotherapist, there wasn't such a thing as a psychotherapist in the 70s. We helped found the counseling movement in this country, and we helped build an organization called the British Association of Counseling, which is now BACP. We started that in the mid-70s with counseling colleagues. So and then in the mid-1980s, Joan particularly more than me, we helped create the United Kingdom Council for Psychotherapy, UKCP, and that was 1986. And training at that point to become a counselor or psychotherapist was between 3 and 5 years. And so, and in the mid-80s, as UKCP began to function, and it's a very effective organization, because we've been very fortunate in the UK in as much that we don't have statutory registration. Unlike across Europe, you have to be a doctor or a clinical psych to study psychotherapy. In this country, UKCP functions in that way, and it's a very broad church. And Joan, in fact, Joan and Diana were part of creating that back in 1986. And Joan was on the governing board for a while. So, but that's a very important step in building the professional identity for psychotherapy, but also for psychosynthesis.
Wow. If we should talk about some of the core elements of psychosynthesis, what was it with that particular psychology that really ignited you? Because you have spent so many years within that entity, we could almost call it.
Yes.
This vision of what we might be. If you should pull out some of the elements of psychosynthesis you think is unique compared to other modalities, what would that be?
I think for me, this absolutely central is, and I remember talking with Roberto about this, and it's what I said early on about meeting him, is that Assagioli saw the self as an ontological reality. The self exists in every person, in every human being. The self exists, and that for me is the core. And if you understand that, if you really get to that and see that and learn how to work with that and how to really see the self, in my language, to see the being, to see the self, which is what he did all the time. That is the core for me of psychosynthesis. And that's the starting point. You see, Jung doesn't go anywhere near that. Most of this transpersonal psychologies point to that, but don't really. Hillman's ceiling was never the self; it was always soul. And really went to self, and the implications of the self as an ontological reality means that the self is always expressing, always becoming. It's not just seeking self; it's understanding that inherent in self is the will to express, and it's doing that.
And what type of language would you use to point to what the self is? It's an ontological reality, so it's something that is really fundamentally a reality, but a reality of what?
Well, there's no thing. There's the reality is no thing, and as we go towards self, we realize there's nothing, and it's paradoxical. It's totally paradoxical. And we use the I self model, where the understanding that the I is a reflection. If you think about Assagioli's work and his writings, he's very clear that the self is the reflection of the self, is the I, is the small self. But really understanding what that means is that the I is the immanent self, and that much self as we can experience or express at any point. As we begin to understand the I and that model of the I self, that individuality is about the I, self is about both individuality and the whole, both individuality and the universal. And that for me is core to everything we do, and all of our training and thinking is, how do we learn to see self? How do we learn to work with the I as it becomes more and more itself?
Yeah. And when you say that it's nothing, it's no thing, so it's a contentless experience of, I know that some of the words he uses is that contentless awareness, pure consciousness, and of course also will, but I just read in some papers that I that I dive into in the AAP archive. In the early days when he assembled the group in the Psychosynthesis Research Foundation, they really worked on trying to grasp what the self is, because if you haven't had the experience, you can actually not understand it, but you can have some mental formulation of it. But he
But that's
points to the experience of individuality and universality, that you have an experience of the universal as an individual, but it's not a
no,
separated individual.
and you see, for me, that's what that language you're using is the closest, I would say, to understanding self. However, and this is where it gets really, really tricky. You see, a lot of people see that experience as awareness or consciousness, and inherent in Roberto's work on self is the will at that level,
Yes.
is the will of self. And a lot of people don't really understand that until they start to let go to what it means to really deeply experience self.
Yeah.
And as they do that, they realize the will is always, the self is always expressing, the will is always expressing itself. And
Yeah.
that's very powerful. And
Yeah.
we turned our training on its head, really, about, I think I mentioned this to you when we met earlier last year. We turned our training on its head in how we ran our training about 15 years ago, when we said, instead of really seeing the training as a series of sequential steps in terms of working on personal psychosynthesis, really, and in order to connect to self, we've turned that around and said the self exists. The self is always present, and therefore let's really help people work with self and its disturbances, where the disturbances are key to unpacking and unlocking the experience of self, rather than you have to clear everything out first in order to get to self. That's been really profound for us in how we run training, because it also, it's not so much streamlining, but it really speaks directly to working with the being at whatever level and at whatever level. It's very powerful. And inherent in that process is the process of synthesis,
Yeah. So if we look at the training you are doing at the Institute, then we have a counselor training. Or perhaps you could give us an overview of how the program looks.
Well, it's really interesting because, again, we've shifted dramatically. And I think I mentioned this before to you. Whereas before, Roberto was very clear. He wanted psychosynthesis to be acknowledged, understood as a psychology, not as a therapy but as a psychology. And so we talk about psychosynthesis as a psychospiritual psychology. Now, initially, to anchor it here, we went the route of counseling and then psychotherapy as its identity. And then later on, we started training coaches as well. And that's been a very powerful part of our identity. Until about 10, 12 years ago, when we said, we're not just reaching to people, we don't believe we're just reaching to people who want to be trained as counselors, coaches, or psychotherapists. We believe there's a whole other constituency that really could benefit hugely from psychosynthesis as a psychospiritual psychology to shift the way they see their professional life, their personal life. And so we changed our strap on the Institute to serving humanity in transition, away from just being a counseling, coaching, psychotherapy college. And that's been a huge lift for us to say, so we're reaching into social activists, to social entrepreneurs, to professionals like psychiatrists, educators who want to bring a psychospiritual context to what they do.
Yeah.
Now that shift is huge.
Mm.
And initially we had our training program, psychotherapy and counseling. We had it validated by Middlesex University to give an MA for psychotherapy and applied psychosynthesis. That changed about 10, 12 years ago when we agreed with Middlesex. They would award an MA for psychosynthesis psychology and for psychosynthesis leadership and organizational coaching. And that was about 12 years ago. And again, within the context of serving humanity. And so we have an MA program of 3 years, modules 1, module 2, plus a thesis year for both psychology and leadership and organizational coaching. Subsequent to that, when people have done that, or during the last phase of that, they can then choose to go into specifically a clinical program of counseling and psychotherapy. So that program is another three years or so.
Yeah, but is it possible to just start with a counselor and then becoming a psychotherapist? So you can also go the other way around.
Yes, but you need to have done, in our terms, you need to have done the MA first, because that's the ground. Because that MA, the modules 1 and modules 2, they transform the inner ground. It's a level of depth that they have therapy throughout those 2-3 years. But in the experiential work they do, they deeply have an experience relative of self and really start to understand the ground out of which they're living.
Yeah. Okay, I can see from that perspective, you have a much broader reach out to many, many different types of professionals that get invited into the psychosynthesis worldview, so to speak.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's really important, Ken, because I think, and you asked me in a mail about a week or so ago, you say, where's your heart? You know, and that's where my heart is at this wrinkly old age that I am. My heart is really, and I mean this my heart is really seeing psychosynthesis, the platform for psychosynthesis, just growing. The need for a psychospiritual psychology today is huge, Ken. And I don't just psychosynthesis. Any psychology that has a spiritual context, not a religious context, has a spiritual context. The value of that to our world in terms of dealing with our narcissism, really taking us to another level of understanding humanity and serving the whole. For me, that's where my heart goes.
Yeah.
That's Jo. I know you know that Joan was writing a book. She's just finished her book, by the way.
Wow! Congratulations.
Yeah, and it should be. That's where my heart is also, as you can imagine. But her book is Psychosynthesis as a Psychospiritual Psychology, and it really speaks to exactly these issues. And it's lovely. It's a lovely piece of work, and hopefully we'll have it published in the next month or two. But it's very important for me that it's to a much broader reach than just to coaches and counselors, therapists.
Yes.
I know that's where your heart is too. You know, the reach of psychosynthesis is huge.
Yeah. So if people contemplate doing this MA and they might be an engineer, they might be a doctor in philosophy, or they might be anywhere, and they want to have that worldview, what do you think is the most key insight these people will get after having spent 3 years within your MA program?
That's a great question, and I think the critical thing is to keep it very simple and to say the perspective that we think is that they, first of all, they know they have an inner ground and that inner ground is subjective. It's about internally their inner
Mm.
world. And their inner world, in that inner world, they realize they're part of a larger whole, and that
Yeah.
their life is about serving that whole, whether it's
Yeah.
in their family, whether it's their kids, whether it's their grandkids, but also in their profession. That this is about right relations. How do we be with other people in so that for me is a fundamental spiritual context
Yeah.
that says we serve the whole. And the
Yeah.
whole, and if you think about what's going on in the world today, we need people to start thinking and holding the world as a whole and holding others. So that's core. And the fact they also have a choice. And that choice, as I talked about with the group way back, that's an existential issue. That existential issue is, am I really behaving deeply in myself, in the way that I know I need to?
Yeah.
And I'm internally the judge of that in relation to the whole. That's not what other people tell me. That's who I am.
Yeah. So I imagine that during these 3 years, there will be a lot of meditation, a lot of reflection, discussion with peer groups, and people in some way have an opportunity to align with their self, align with their purpose, with meaning, and finding in some way what Ken Wilber calls your cosmic address. Where you can
That's a
take
great
your stand and express your qualities and your creative abilities.
You see, you've hit the nail on the head, and I think one of the things I make sure as much as we can every year to update our website with the reflections of our students, and so there are 2 videos. One's with an online group because we offer online training as well as face to face, and there are 2 groups on our current website, and they talk about what this experience has meant, and also talk about how it's transformed their lives in the way that you've
Yeah.
just talked about. It's
Yeah.
so fundamental. And as I mentioned earlier to you, before we started, I'm very excited that we're offering our online MAs this October in 25 in the US as well, with a very specific US program. And we've got the
Wow.
support of the AAP, and Dee Dee Furman and other people in the US. I think, for me, it's about giving something back to really see how we can start anchoring psychosynthesis as an academic program in the US as well. And
Yes.
and hopefully some of these people are then going to take that on. But we've got a number of US students as part of our online groups at the moment, and they're very excited to see that
And this
happening. And it'll be
and
times.
the US program, is that also validated by Middlesex
Yeah,
University?
exactly. No, it's an
Oh,
MA. Oh, absolutely, and that's part of the value, you see. And of course, in the US, our MA costs somewhat different than most of the US MA programs. But the critical thing is it has that university validation.
yeah. But do you have to come from US to embark on that program, or do you have another program for Europeans, or how is that?
Oh yeah, no, we have a regular, which we've been running now for 4 years, a distance education online MA, and we have participants from New Zealand, from the US, from all across Europe in that program,
Yeah.
and so that continues anyway. So there'll be 3 strands to the MA this October: one face to face in London, one online across Europe, across other parts of the world, India, and also the US.
Yeah. Okay. That's quite a huge outreach. Um, And so I understand when they have done that MA, then the next opportunity is to start the counseling or the coaching training. Is
Yeah,
the
they can
coaching
do
training
the
online
coaching
too,
training.
or
Yeah, no, it's all online. The
mm,
coaching, and that's very interesting because we do an extended third year for the coaches. They have a preclinical coaching program in module 2, and then in module 3 they have a very specialized training in leadership and organizational coaching.
mm,
And we've trained a lot of coaches over the years now,
mm,
so it's very powerful, and
mm,
I'm very excited by it because a lot of people, because it's online, people can come from all over the world to participate.
yeah. But the counselor training I expect is physical. This is where you meet physically at your place in
Not
London.
necessarily. Well, yes, a lot of it does happen there, but we have different levels of it. We have a diploma in counseling that we offer, which is a
Mm,
very simple in the sense that it's fairly simple. We have 100 hours and I forget how many supervisions, 15, 17 supervisions. And
yeah.
that can be done online. And if somebody's from overseas, they can do it. And then they choose how they're going to get accredited or not locally. But they can still
Okay.
do that piece online. If you're going to practice as a psychotherapist here, then 50% through UKCB has to be done face to face. But that's
Yeah.
different.
Okay. Wow, that's really a big picture you are painting here. Is there anything, if we should conclude our conversation here, is there anything we haven't touched on that you think is important for people to know?
Good question. Let me think. You know what? We've touched on this, Kenneth, and I know you a little bit these days, and I love this conversation. By the way, it's very easy and very helpful. Uh,
Mm,
but there's something I think we should touch on about psychosynthesis. For me, it's about the heart,
mm,
and it's learning what it means to see with the heart and the place of the heart in our lives going forward. And why I'm saying that is, for me, that's what I've learned in working in psychosynthesis to the best I can. And of course,
mm,
I'm limited as the rest of us are, but learning to see with the heart and the humility we have as we begin to open our hearts to other people, then
mm,
that's what transforms us and the world.
mm,
Because that's in relation to our kids, to our relations, to our family. It's so core for me. And
mm.
I say to our trainees, um, I'm not just you're not just learning how to self-reflect and disidentify and see yourself as a subject to your life. I also want you to put a hat on which enables you to see others. And as you see others, I want you to learn how to see the being, how to see the self. In order to do that, you need to open your heart. And I'm not
Yeah.
just talking about physically, I'm talking about learning to see the whole.
Mm,
And that
yeah.
level of heart, Ken, you know that as well as I
Mm,
do. And what happens when you open your heart? It's stunning. And you
yeah.
see a lot of pain as well as a lot of beauty. But
Yeah.
that's what we have to learn to see.
Mm. I would also say that is perhaps the most central aspect for me with psychosynthesis. And I call it, establish the loving observer,
Exactly.
becoming a loving observer. And you start with your own shadows, with your own painful aspect, and then you can much easier embrace them in other people when you encounter it. So it's
Well, if you
such a,
I agree with you. And if you learn to do what you're saying,
mm,
that's amazing because it transforms. And it's not easy. I'm not saying it's easy.
no, it's not
There's
easy.
all the stuff around it. But that level that you're describing, when you go
Mm,
to that level of that, it is so extraordinary, you know.
mm, mm,
It really is. We were watching the VE Day um, 80-year celebrations over the last couple of days. And it is incredibly moving because, and what's so moving for me in that, and if you look at it, is it's not about the victory, it's about the sacrifice people made, whether they were being bombed, wherever they were, whether they're here, whether they're in Germany particularly. It's the sacrifice. What folk went through is insane. But if you can open your heart to that, you see the beauty of it, but you also see the intense pain at the same time.
Yeah. Wow, Roger, this has been an incredible story, and I'm so thankful that we got this interview and conversation. And so we also have your story about how it unfolded over there. You are one of the grand old men.
Thank you. Talk about Graham. I'm certainly old. Yeah, but it's important. It's wonderful to be alive at this time, though, Ken, isn't it?
Yeah, because
Really.
there's a great call for people who can bridge of the oppositions and all the turmoil and chaos and conflicts that's in the world right now.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to get you a copy of Joan's book as soon as possible, because she talks in the last part of it about cracking the kernel of narcissism.
Wow.
As that step towards seeing the whole. And
What's the title? What's the title of the book?
The working title, it's probably is going to be this, is called 0 Point: Psychosynthesis as a Psychospiritual Psychology.
Yes. I'm looking so much forward to receive it, and send all my love to Joan. And of course, we will put all the links to the Institute's website.
I'm really grateful for this, Ken. Let me say this to you, because I think this is a stroke, by the way. I'm going to stroke, all right? And because it's important. No, but I know it's fine. The reason I'm saying it is I think what you do for psychosynthesis in terms of your presence and how you hold the outreach for psychosynthesis is immensely important. I said this to you before, I know, but I'm saying it now. I really appreciate this interview, and it's great talking about these things because we're both of us very passionate about them. But I want to acknowledge you and your presence and how you do that. It's real.
Thank you, Roger.
It really is. And I thank you enormously for it.
Thank you. And until we see again, bon voyage.
Merci bien. Take care. Ciao.
Take care.
Bye.
Ciao.